The Fox Kids Club is brought to you by the Eclipse Studios Patreon. You can find it at www.patreon.com/Eclipse Studios Network. Your contribution will be greatly appreciated, as every dollar goes towards research, production software, stock footage, and everything needed to create the best video that I can. You can also support me by subscribing to my channel, hitting the bell icon for notifications, and spreading the word far and wide on social media. Thank you, and enjoy the show. They say history is written by the winners. I believe it. I work retail. I can speak from experience here. At least once a day, I will see somebody in the store wearing a 90s Nicktoons shirt. There's nothing wrong with 90s Nicktoons. Those cartoons are certainly great, and the rise of Nickelodeon to dominance is probably the story of the 1990s in kids' TV as a whole. But it was more of a slow climb than a sudden ascent. Nick didn't overtake the broadcast networks until relatively late in the decade. But it's not like they obliterated Saturday morning right away. Saturday morning was already being chipped away at. In the 1980s, spurred by deregulation and an explosion in local independent stations, cartoons proliferated in weekday afternoon syndication. This market, originally dominated by low-quality toy tie-ins, got a significant boost with Disney's high-quality DuckTales in 1987. At the same time, many of these stations joined a new, fledgling fourth network known as Fox. When Disney started getting cute with business terms for their shows, Fox went into business for themselves and created the Fox Kids Network. Making the fortuitous choice of tapping a veteran studio boss with big ideas as its network head, Fox Kids overtook the established Saturday morning blocks in just its third year, and that was before they even stumbled into a mega hit the very next season. It could have lasted, and it probably should have lasted, but a combination of a radically changing affiliate base, changing government regulations, a vastly changing kids' TV marketplace, and a disastrous venture into cable television all meant that, 12 years almost to the day, the Fox Kids Network signed off the air, its time slots going to 4Kids Entertainment on weekends, and on weekdays to shows like Judge Judy. Its programming library ended up in the Disney Vault 18 years before Disney snagged the rest of 20th Century Fox. The story of Fox Kids is a fascinating one, and honestly, it's one that should be told. One story at a time, one show at a time. So get ready to take one hell of a ride. You're inducted into the Fox Kids Club. To understand what Fox Kids was, we have to start with the early days of television. Before streaming services, before HD, before 500 channel cable, before even color. When TV first arrived in American homes, it was not long before shows like Howdy Doody and Captain Kangaroo were entertaining kids with their cheerful hosts and puppet antics. Cartoons also migrated to the new medium, both the great shorts of the silver screen and original creations for television, led by the Hanna-Barbera studio. While the financial realities of television necessarily meant a far less lavish product, characters like Yogi Bear, Huckleberry Hound, and Fred Flintstone made a lasting impact on the collective consciousness of a generation. By the late 1960s, all three major networks had adopted Saturday mornings as their exclusive programming destination for kids. Youngsters growing up got to experience 4 to 5 hours of nothing but cartoons and live action shows so outlandish they may as well have been cartoons. The likes of Scooby-Doo, the Hair Bear Bunch, the Super Friends, and a whole lot more dominated the airwaves during this period. While this sounds like paradise, it really was not. The quality of animation in particular was on the decline. Shows were decided upon by network executives. Scooby-Doo was a vivid example of this. CBS programming wizard Fred Silverman was just as heavily involved in the program's creation as its actual creators over at the Hanna-Barbera studio. With just 3 national networks, the medium of television animation began to stagnate. Much of Hanna-Barbera's output during the 1970s, for example, can be distilled to Scooby-Doo, but blank. Scooby-Doo, but the dog is a shark. Scooby-Doo, but the dog is a ghost. Scooby-Doo, but there are 2 dogs. By the dawn of the 1980s, the medium of children's programming was in clear recession. It got worse, but by the end of the decade, new outlets, new studios, and new emerging talent heralded the beginnings of a revival. The most pivotal new outlets were beginning to come into their own around this time: independent television stations. If you were born after 1993, you might not realize this, but many of those stations that currently air Fox or CW programming originally had no network affiliation at all, hence the term independent. These were usually UHF stations that, before the dawn of cable, didn't have as much reach as the big network affiliates. In fact, until 1964, TV sets in the United States were not required to have tuners that could receive these UHF channels. Even when sets were required to include UHF tuners, the comparatively poor reach of these stations in the days of analog television signals meant that many markets only had 1 or 2 independent stations, if they had any at all. What changed this? Well, cable. Analog reception was notoriously finicky, and if you didn't live in the right area, it was almost non-existent. And UHF stations were the hardest to receive in suboptimal conditions. Yes, cable would prove to be a major source of programming beginning in the 1980s, and the original programming on channels like Nickelodeon would eclipse that of broadcast by the end of the 1990s. But in the beginning, cable's biggest impact wasn't the original programming. It was that it simply leveled the playing field. This helped the number of independent stations explode from 100 in 1980 to about 3 times that by the middle of the decade. So, how did independent stations run? Well, most of them would engage in the art of counter-programming. In prime time, when the networks would run their top shows, your average independent would typically run a nightly movie.
You've seen the neighborhoods disappear. You need to watch.
I said I'm going to get myself a gun.
If you've seen the violence run rampant, you need to watch.
Somebody help me!
If you've seen the children live in fear, you need to watch.
You're finished, big man.
If you care about the decay of your neighbors,
What I want to know is when are you guys going to give up some protection from those bastards?
you need to watch this powerful story of a community taking back the streets. Defiance, Monday at 8 on Philly 57.
At the dinner hour, when the network affiliates would run their local and national newscasts, the indies would program sitcom reruns like MASH or Happy Days.
Friday at 5:30. Charles.
Oh, good, Jamie. Look, we need groceries. Can you go to the market?
No.
is in charge?
No, Adam, you cannot set off fireworks in the living room.
Charles in Charge, Friday at 5:30 here on Philly 57.
And in the afternoons, where the networks ran their soap operas and talk shows, these stations proudly aired kid shows just in time for school to let out. Finally, this is where we get to the cartoon stuff.
They're hip. Right on! They're the newest and coolest heroes.
Rock, dudes!
And they're green.
Who the heck are you guys?
They're the
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Bingo. Yeah, we're dealing with a real mind here.
and they know how to battle the bad guys, so get ready
Let's show them the turtles know how to party!
for those heroes in a half shell. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, today at 4:30 on Philly 57.
This is gonna be fun!
Until the 1980s, you'd basically find just the old standbys on these stations. Classic theatrical cartoons like Looney Tunes, Tom and Jerry, and Popeye. You'd also see TV cartoons that ran for years, long enough to garner a back catalog that could air every day after school. Occasionally, you would get something like Battle of the Planets, an original production of syndication that was a dub of the anime Gatchaman. But by 1983, things were changing. New methods of distribution, such as satellite, would make it easier to distribute original shows directly to syndication. French-American studio DiC was an early adopter, premiering its Inspector Gadget that year, but Inspector Gadget wasn't the breakthrough. At the same time that syndication was ramping up, Ronald Reagan's FCC had repealed rules that restricted the content allowed in animated series targeted to children. Most notably, you could now create a cartoon based on a toy. The result?
And the Masters of the Universe.
He-Man was a smash hit, and it did not take long for its effects to be felt. Here is the October 1984 schedule for the top two independent stations in New York City, Channel 5 and Channel 11. As you can see, He-Man is the sole toy-based show in both stations' weekday lineups. Now, here's the schedule from just 1 year later. We've gone from one toy-based show to 8. A lot of these shows operated under the mentality, promote the toy first, do everything else second. Worse, many of these shows had huge 65-episode orders that premiered in one go. With the exception of Filmation, every studio would have the bulk of the animation work produced by overseas studios. Outside of maybe the title sequence, the resulting quality simply was not great. By the end of the decade, there were some signs of life. At least on Saturday mornings, there were genuine efforts to improve the quality of programming meant for kids. CBS especially. Under the leadership of Judy Price, the network was increasingly offering kid shows of notable quality, like Muppet Babies, Pee-wee's Playhouse, the Ralph Bakshi Mighty Mouse, and Garfield and Friends. ABC was not nearly as stellar, but they were the home of the surprisingly good Beetlejuice cartoon, as well as the early seasons of The Real Ghostbusters. NBC wasn't doing hot, but they had Saved by the Bell, so I guess that's something? Yet, good network executives are only going to do so much when the leading producers included a Marvel Comics owned studio that was not making Marvel Comics cartoons, or a studio affectionately nicknamed Does It Cheap. Fortunately, in the mid-1980s, a 900-pound mouse entered the room. The 1984 arrival of a new regime at the Walt Disney Company, headed by Michael Eisner, Frank Wells, and Jeffrey Katzenberg, changed things dramatically. You're probably familiar with the Disney Renaissance, but the new management embarked on a number of other initiatives to revive the company. These included the expansion of its relatively new mature label, Touchstone Pictures, new projects for the theme park side, including what is now called Disney's Hollywood Studios, and an expanded commitment to television, including a dedicated TV animation studio. For decades, the Walt Disney Company was at best an intermittent producer of television animation. The occasional sequence for Wonderful World of Disney here, a special there. A full animated series was something of a leap for Disney, which was associated with extremely high quality animation that far outstripped what most studios were doing on television at the time. While the TV animation would not be feature quality, nor would it be produced in the United States, Disney still had money, and they would use a considerably higher budget than most studios at the time. Disney put its first TV cartoons on the air in 1985. These were new productions with new characters. What? No Mickey Mouse? Well, no. Mickey Mouse was off limits. So were Donald and Goofy. The new studio was specifically ordered to stay away from the classic Disney library of characters and start with new creations. The first two productions were Adventures of the Gummy Bears, originally for NBC, and Wuzzles, produced for CBS. Gummy Bears came from Michael Eisner himself, who was inspired when his son asked for the candy one day. Wuzzles, on the other hand, was partially funded by Hasbro. Even if the quality of animation is improving, there are still business considerations to remember. Wuzzles came and went pretty quickly, lasting just one season, but Gummy Bears proved popular and managed an extremely healthy 6-season run. The studio then moved to Bigger Fish, or more accurately, Bigger Ducks. This one would be based on one of the studio's more enduring ventures, the beloved Duck comics of Carl Barks. Donald Duck was still mostly off limits, but his nephews and Uncle Scrooge were not. And together with Barks' Rogues Gallery and new characters created specifically for television, they would all be the stars of Disney's DuckTales. This new series would be developed not for network television, but for syndication. Say what you will about He-Man, but its success opened up syndication as a viable alternative to network television, with more and more studios bypassing the networks entirely. The product at the beginning was mostly junk, so there was room for a higher quality production. Disney themselves made light of this in their trade advertising, and Disney would use syndication to enormous success over the next decade. Now, at the same time Disney was developing DuckTales, a billionaire tyrant from Australia was intent on shaking up the network business.
Good evening. This is the 10 o'clock news. I'm Steve Powers. And today, confirmation of the largest single broadcast station transaction in history. It's part of an even bigger deal involving more than $2 billion and the sale of 7 Metro Media stations, including this one, Channel 5, to media mogul Rupert Murdoch. Under the agreement confirmed today, the Hearst Corporation will buy Metro Media's television station in Boston for $450 million. And as Christopher Jones reports, the rest of the huge deal should be completed on Monday.
Considering the size of the deal and its implications for the American communications business, today's announcement was remarkably low-key. But when Australian publishing magnate Rupert Murdoch walked into the Waldorf Towers suite with Metro Media chairman John Kluge, it was clear the deal was done, and the nation's largest independent television group was about to be a jewel in Murdoch's crown.
The deal as contemplated would be that a partnership would be buying these Metro Media stations, which is the same partnership as owns 20th Century Fox. So it's Mr. Marvin Davis and my company, News Corporation.
The man who has been the ultimate authority at the Fox network since its inception has been media mogul Rupert Murdoch. Old Rupert is not the ultimate subject of our story here. Indeed, he would be wooing sports leagues and laying the groundwork for his cable news network while the story of Fox Kids was going on. Australian-born Rupert Murdoch inherited his father's company, News Limited, in 1952, embarking on a period of expansion and embracing a populist approach. Indeed, The Economist credits him with inventing the modern tabloid. In 1968, he entered the UK, first with the purchase of the now-defunct News of the World, then the 1969 acquisition of The Sun, and the 1970 purchase of a stake in struggling ITV station, London Weekend Television. In 1974, Rupert came to America, first with a paper in San Antonio, and 2 years later acquiring the struggling New York Post and injecting it with his trademark character. In March 1984, he bought into the storied 20th Century Fox movie studio. And it's with that purchase that the story of the Fox network truly begins. In May 1985, he announced that he was buying up the 6 Metro Media independent stations. The reason for the acquisition soon became clear. Murdoch was planning to use those 6 stations, all in large markets including New York, LA, and Chicago, as the nucleus of a new 4th television network. Plans for a 4th network had bounced around various companies since the original 4th network, Dumont, faded away in the 1950s. Paramount, for example, had planned the Paramount Television service in the 1970s, and its flagship show was slated to be a revived Star Trek. When that network fell through, that revived Star Trek became that franchise's first feature film. What made this attempt different was that increase in the viability of independent stations. There were enough to go around now to make nationwide availability feasible, and because cable was a thing, the new network would be on a more level playing field, though not equal to the established stations, and the perception of a coat-hanger network would linger for several years.
It may be on a lousy channel, but The Simpsons are on TV.
With the Metro Media deals closing in March 1986, Murdoch ramped up planning for the new network. Usually, the market's top-rated independent would be that market's charter affiliate. One example being Philadelphia's Channel 29, not owned by Fox yet, but owned by Taft Broadcasting. There were some exceptions. In some markets, the former Metro Media station, now owned by Fox, was not the market's top indie station. Chicago's a big example here because Fox now owned Channel 32, but far and away the leading independent station was Channel 9, WGN. In still other cases, the top independent just declined the affiliation whatsoever. For our purposes, the actual launch of the network happened on April 5th, 1987, the first official night of primetime. It was technically on the air before then, but the name Fox wasn't even in use yet, so we're going to go with April 5th, 1987. It did not have an auspicious beginning, but its first 2 primetime shows defined the network. The first, Married with Children, showcased an attitude and edge that the big 3 networks honestly did not have, at least in their comedies at that time. Indeed, its working title was a direct shot at the #1 show on NBC.
They're not the Cosbys, they're the Bundys, and they're married with children.
It had modest ratings at first, but an attempted boycott ended up being the very definition of the Streisand effect, so it became a hit. The second show launched on that night, The Tracy Ullman Show, was a sketch comedy less important for the actual show and more important for the crew cartoons that aired right before a commercial break. And it spawned the longest running primetime series in the history of television. You might know it. It's called The Thompsons. But Fox would work on expanding its programming ambitions in areas other than primetime. Now's a good time to mention the actual head of 20th Century Fox and the Fox Network, Barry Diller. Remember how I just mentioned that attempt at a 4th network that Paramount made in the 1970s? You can credit Barry Diller for that. Diller was very keen on the idea, to the point where he actually left Paramount when his boss at Gulf and Western scrapped the idea. You want to know who worked under Barry Diller at Paramount? Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg. So it might not surprise you that the lead broadcaster for DuckTales was the Fox television stations and many of the Fox affiliates. DuckTales was a hit. The higher quality animation set it apart from pretty much everything in afternoons at the time, and it was the highest rated animated series of the 1987-88 season. It spawned 100 episodes over 4 seasons, 1 theatrical movie, and 1 reboot that is arguably held in greater regard than the original. The success of DuckTales led to more Disney animated productions. In 1989, Disney would introduce Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, again for syndication, and again a huge hit. Disney mobilized their TV animation division to produce 1 new show for syndication each year after that. For fall 1990, that would be Tailspin, a new show using characters from the beloved Disney classic The Jungle Book. Gummy Bears was also put back into production, so for 1990, Disney had 4 cartoons in syndication at the same time, enough to fill the prime 3 to 5 afternoon slot. Say, that's a good name, Disney Afternoon. Let's call it that. But there was trouble brewing between Disney and its network partner of choice. It is here that we get into somewhat muddled territory. The general story is Disney screwed Fox by taking their shows away from that network's owned and operated stations, or O&Os, so Fox created Fox Kids in retaliation. The actual story is a little more complex. I've been chiefly consulting 2 books here, one chronicling the rise of Fox in general, named The 4th Network, and one detailing the turbulent reign of Michael Eisner at Disney, James B. Stewart's Disney War. Both present origins of Fox Kids that diverge from each other. In Disney War, the incident that incited the split was Disney entering the broadcast business for the very first time. Not the way you're thinking, because Disney's acquisition of ABC didn't come for a couple of years. Instead, after a long license battle with the FCC, the owner of KHJ TV9 in Los Angeles put that station up for sale. Disney ended up winning the bidding war, rechristening it KCAL 9, and naturally Disney wanted their cartoons on the Disney television station. One problem! Disney's cartoons were already carried on Fox's LA O&O, KTTV Fox 11. The feud began when Disney bought a Los Angeles television station, named it KCAL, and wanted to air Disney Afternoon, the block of children's programs being carried by Diller's Fox affiliates, including one in Los Angeles. Eisner had Katzenberg call Diller. In Diller's recounting of the discussion, Katzenberg said, "We want to renegotiate Disney Afternoon, and we're taking away the LA market." Diller was shocked. They had a contract. "That's not fair," he protested. "I know you bought an LA station, but give us 2 or 3 years to replace this. Let's be reasonable." Diller called Eisner, who refused. "We were there for you when you needed us," Diller reminded him, pointing out that he'd bought the original programming for Disney Afternoon. Eisner still refused. "Okay then, we're out of business," Diller said. Other sources paint a different picture. According to Daniel M. Kimmel's The Fourth Network, How Fox Broke the Rules and Reinvented Television, the inciting incident wasn't necessarily Fox retaliating against Disney for moving its cartoons, but affiliate stations just getting tired of the increasing leverage that Disney and other syndicators had over them. Most syndicated shows, from DuckTales then to something like Jeopardy now, are made available through something called barter syndication. Basically, that meant the production company offers the shows to the station for free, with the catch that a certain amount of advertising time per hour is given over to them. So, let's say it's 1989 and you want to run DuckTales. DuckTales episodes are 24 minutes, which leaves 6 minutes in the half hour for advertising. Disney would take 2 minutes of that for national ads where it would keep the proceeds, and the remaining 4 minutes would be left for the station to sell for itself. By 1989, when Disney was becoming the market leader, they were starting to turn the screws to their stations and took more of the advertising time for themselves. Advertising is the lifeblood of local stations. The more local money, the better. This is one reason why most stations now run hours of local news programming a day, because 100% of that ad revenue goes to the local station. They don't have to give CBS anything. They get all of it. So Disney claiming more of that revenue for themselves was great for Disney, not so great for Fox 26. The syndicators that were clearing kid shows on our stations were increasing the barter load every year. Every 6 months, it seemed like, recalled former Grand Rapids station executive Patrick Mullen. We went from 2 minutes to 2.5 to free, and even threats of 3.5 minutes per show in barter load. So we were losing our commercial avails, and the kids' business was a huge source of revenue for all of us at that point. Even other studios were complaining about Disney's strong-arm tactics. An article in the May 23, 1990 issue of Variety details an unknown syndicator's claim that Disney was forcing stations to clear the entirety of their expanded Disney Afternoon lineup, charging that it was trying to eliminate all competition. So, it wasn't just Fox that had problems with Disney. The affiliate owners and managers themselves had growing concern. In fact, the person we can most accurately call the father of Fox Kids wasn't Rupert Murdoch, wasn't Barry Diller, wasn't even network president Jamie Kellner. It was Harry Pappas, the owner of several Fox affiliates. In 1989, station owner Harry Pappas, a California businessman who owned a group of stations in 6 states, including California, Nevada, and North Carolina, approached Fox president Jamie Kellner with an idea. Why don't you do for us and kids what you're doing for us in prime time? Kellner liked it immediately. The concept of how Fox would sell network kids programming to the affiliates was the real genius of Pappas's suggestion. Unlike anything offered by the Big Three to their affiliates, the Fox Kids Network would be co-owned by Fox and the individual stations, with the stations sharing in the eventual profits when they occurred. That proved to be a great incentive to get the stations to run the Fox Network's cartoon shows instead of cutting their own deals with Disney. I basically used Harry Pappas to kind of front the whole thing. Ideas that come from the affiliate groups are received better by the affiliates than the network ideas, said Kellner. That little wrinkle really was a selling point to the affiliates. When Mighty Morphin Power Rangers made it big, the network president was able to get affiliates to carry the show by offering them a cut of the toy sales. So was the creation of Fox Kids retaliation towards Disney? I'm gonna say no, at least not entirely. Yes, Fox had every reason to tell the mouse to fuck off with its demands to move its programming off of its LA stations. But many stations were starting to have problems with Disney and other syndicators, creating an environment where the stations were willing to seek an alternative. They had skin in the game. So even if Disney and Fox didn't have a rift, it's extremely likely the stations would look to Fox for an alternative anyway. There's one more reason I'm more apt to go with Kimmel's account over Stewart's book. Disney War has a lot of information about the sale of Fox Family Channel and the Fox Kids properties to Disney, and that's something that we will cover late in this series. This includes the claim that Disney had to keep the word family in the channel's name in perpetuity. Whether this was even true or not is a matter of dispute, because the channel, by then ABC Family, did drop family from the name in January 2016, adopting the name Freeform. Simply put, there's a lot more evidence that Fox Kids was established because of a variety of factors, and not simply a retaliation against Disney for pulling their shows from Fox stations. So, on June 14th, 1989, Fox officially announced the creation of what internally would be known as the Fox Children's Network. Just as Pappas proposed, it would be a profit-sharing venture between the network and the affiliates, legally separate from the main Fox Broadcasting Company. This was also convenient because Fox was technically illegal. This is vastly oversimplifying things, but at the time, networks could not own their own production studio. There was a loophole. You were only a network if you programmed a certain amount of hours, and Fox programmed just enough hours to stay under that limit. That didn't mean that Fox was immune to legal scrutiny. In fact, Disney used those technical violations as the basis of two actions in early 1990 meant to derail the launch of Fox Kids. The first was a petition to the FCC against a waiver that Fox was seeking to allow it to escape the existing regulations. The second was a 5-count antitrust lawsuit alleging that Fox was strong-arming their stations to carry Fox Kids instead of Disney Afternoon. 3 of the stations named in the suit as being strong-armed, however, denied any wrongdoing on the part of Fox and even emphasized, hey, the Kids Network was their idea. That didn't mean that everyone was on Fox's side. KCPQ, the Fox station in Seattle, inked a deal to carry the Disney Afternoon and was publicly blasted by Fox Affiliate Committee Chairman Kevin O'Brien for doing so, to the point of threatening to strip the station of its affiliation. This was an outlier, however, and by all accounts, Disney was much more of the aggressor. Kevin O'Brien's own station, KTVU, was stripped of its Disney affiliation. It might not surprise you that the antitrust suits were dropped a few years into Fox Kids' run. The petition also failed, as Fox did end up getting that waiver. The whole rule was actually repealed later in the 1990s. To the benefit of Disney, of course, because they proceeded to buy up ABC. With the announcement of the Fox Children's Network, executives from all of the major studios in town were setting up meetings with Fox Network president Jamie Kellner. It was, after all, another place to sell their shows, and with the rapid growth of Fox itself, a potentially lucrative one. One of Kellner's meetings was with the head of Marvel Productions, an animation studio affiliated with Marvel Comics. The informal conversation turned to other matters, such as who would head a Fox Kids network. The head of the studio suggested a few names, until Kellner just point-blank asked, "Well, how about you head up the Fox Kids network?" And that's how Margaret Loesch became the Fox Kids Network's first president, and it was a decision that would pay off handsomely. Margaret Loesch had been around the business for a long time, starting in a programming position in 1971 at ABC, and then moving over to NBC later in the decade. In 1975, she jumped to the production end, spending 5 years at Hanna-Barbera as an executive vice president, often credited alongside Jean McCurdy, who herself would be a big figure as she would jump over to revive Warner Brothers' dormant animation division in the late 1980s. In 1984, she was recruited as president and CEO of Marvel Productions, the film and animation arm of Marvel Comics, working side by side with the legendary Stan Lee, amazingly enough, as his boss. I'll dive more fully into the history of Marvel Productions in a couple of videos during Fox Kids Club because it's a fascinating story, but it was a position that proved frustrating for Loesch. She was a fan of the comics, unlike her predecessor. She introduced a new animated logo that very prominently featured Spider-Man, but sadly that was one of the very few things she was able to do with an actual Marvel superhero while she was there. This sounds crazy now, but there was a time when Marvel was not a mainstream force. In fact, superheroes in general were not big for most of the 1980s. The Superman film series hit a brick wall, and the genre did not really recover until the first Tim Burton Batman movie. More importantly, Marvel was not considered a major media company, nor was it really part of one until Disney in the 2010s. Marvel was owned by a procession of, let's just say, colorful entities, from a pulp magazine publisher to an ownership conglomerate so shadowy that I can barely find any information on it, to a small-time movie studio that honestly thought they purchased Superman. That's the other company. Marvel Productions was successful, but not for anything Marvel. They were your go-to for licensed properties. Muppet Babies, Dungeons and Dragons, the Hasbro duo of G.I. Joe and Transformers. All of those shows originated at least partially from Marvel's animation studio. It was enough for the studio to unveil a syndicated package called Marvel Action Universe. And it was headlined by Dino Riders, which was a Tyco-owned toy line, RoboCop, also not owned by Marvel, and also a violent R-rated movie that should not have been a cartoon, and years-old repeats of the comics inaccurate Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Hardly what you'd consider Marvel. It's shocking. We live in a world where far less well-known Marvel characters like Rocket, Raccoon, and the Falcon are headlining blockbuster movies and TV shows. And where one of the highest grossing movies is a pretty close adaptation of the Infinity Gauntlet. Marvel is one of the most talked about properties in the world today, so the fact that Marvel Comics not all that long ago could not even sell cartoons based on their superheroes, it boggles the mind. Lesh wouldn't forget this, and she'd take the pet project from her days at Marvel with her to Fox Kids. But we're going to get to that little X project later on. A more pressing issue was her contract. By 1990, Marvel Comics and Marvel Productions were overall owned by entities controlled by Marvel's latest colorful owner, corporate raider Ronald Perelman. You want to remember that name because, for very non-Marvel related reasons, he's really important once we get to 1994. Perelman would not let her out of her contract, and that was a problem because in order to prevent any Disney-related shenanigans, Fox Kids had a hard fall 1990 launch date. Perelman only relented when Barry Diller told him about that said X project that Lesh took with her to Fox. This meant that Lesh was less involved in planning that fall schedule than she would have liked. By the time she came on board, the inaugural fall slate was well underway. 7 shows, all from different production companies. With the exception of 2, Fox Kids owned all of them. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, the Fox Kids Club proudly presents to you your 1990-91 Fox Kids starting lineup. Bobby's World, a Film Roman Fox Kids co-production about a precocious young child, voiced by Howie Mandel, who also executive produces. Bigsburg Bigs, a cartoon about a world populated entirely of talking pigs, but is really a half hour of I don't know what the f***, from Fox Kids, Fred Silverman, and Ruby Spears. Tom and Jerry Kids, the cat and mouse duo in prepubescent form, produced by Hanna-Barbera in association with future owner Turner Broadcasting. Fox's Funhouse, the 3rd season of a live-action game show in the Double Dare vein, from Stone Stanley, Telepictures, and Warner Brothers. Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, which pretty much explains itself, from Marvel Productions and Fox Kids. Zazu U, a really tough to describe show that was a throwback and simultaneously ahead of its time, created by Shane B. Roth and produced by Film Roman and Fox Kids. And the flagship of the block and the sole weekday program this year, Fox's Peter Pan and the Pirates. An adaptation of Peter Pan from the original novels, unrelated to the Disney film, from TMS Entertainment, Southern Star Productions, and Fox Kids. In addition, 2 additional shows had notable runs during mid-season. Swamp Thing, a show about DC's iconic swamp monster hailing from the incredible world of Deke. And Dark Water, a big-budget, original Hanna-Barbera production about a crew of misfits trying to save the land of Myr from the dark water engulfing the land. Fox Kids would air the first 5 episodes of this show as a miniseries, but did not pick it up for a further run. ABC did, with the show retitled The Pirates of Darkwater for all future airings. The network came online on September 8, 1990. The on-air name of the network would be the Fox Kids Network, expanding on a branding initiative that Fox launched prior to the launch of the network. Local affiliates would have their own Fox Kids clubs, a way to promote audience involvement in the station's kids lineup. The branding also encouraged post segments. While not every affiliate did these, a lot of the bigger stations took part. Flagship station WNYW New York used DJ Cat, a character created for Rupert's Sky Channel over in the UK. WFLD Chicago used Rich Koz, who's best known nationally today as MeTV's Svengoolie. WDRB in Louisville, Kentucky was notable for using actual kids and teens, and WCGV, then Fox 24 in Milwaukee, used kill it with fire! The chief benefit of the initiative, alongside a membership card, was Totally Kids Magazine, a house organ that promoted what was currently airing on Fox Kids. The magazine, eventually renamed Fox Kids Magazine by the late 90s, lasted throughout the network's run. The early issues are notable because they are strongly tied into the Kids Club concept. Readers were specifically encouraged not to watch your Fox station, but your Fox Kids Club station for the new shows. The Fox Kids Club was important to the life cycle of the network, and the more I researched it, the more I realized it deserves to be discussed in detail. So watch this space. I'm going to get back to it. Fox Kids launched at a boom time for animation. The entry of Disney into TV animation a few years back, the success of Roger Rabbit also a few years back, and the revival of the medium in general meant that there was a glut for fall 1990. Wang Film Production, a notable overseas studio, animated more minutes of animation for this season alone than Disney did for all of their animated films up to this point. The late episode and substandard animation were unfortunately common this year, and no broadcaster felt this more keenly than Fox Kids. One important show not on the lineup this first year that you might have been expecting? Tiny Toon Adventures. Now, many Fox stations, including the O&Os, picked the show up for their fall lineups, but it was only syndicated at this point, and some non-Fox stations also carried the show. WB's involvement in Fox Kids was limited this first season. Funhouse was notably the only WB show on the block. But plans were in place to secure the future, and Warner Brothers, not to mention the Warner sister, would make their presence known in a very big way in the years to come. All Fox affiliates carried the weekday and Saturday lineups with the exception of one outlier. In Miami, a major affiliation switch had recently occurred. It's a complex story with a ton of drama, but on New Year's Day 1989, the NBC affiliation moved from WSVN Channel 7 to the newly NBC-owned Channel 4 WTVJ. CBS, for its part, did not move to Channel 7, but WCIX Channel 6, which it had also recently purchased. WSVN, for its part, was seen as the big loser. WSVN was a major market Big 3 station with the programming mix you'd expect: talk shows, game shows, and news. Instead of picking up cartoons, sitcoms, and downsizing or closing the news department, it actually made the news department the station's centerpiece. The format was changed, and the dowdy News Center 7 became the flashy, tabloid, MTV-inspired Channel 7 News.
Live from Channel 7, South Florida's news station. Denise White, Rick Sanchez, weather with Bob Soper, and sports with Jim Barry. This is Channel 7 News at 6:30.
Two pit bulls that two judges wanted to put to death a year and a half ago are still alive, and according to officials, neater than ever. Hello again, everybody. We have also learned tonight that if you live in Broward County, you are likely footing the bill to keep...
Hours of additional news programs were added to the schedule. Outside of news, the station picked up whatever it could manage. 2 o'clock Matlock, weekend WWF, 8 o'clock movies, and on the 2 nights it programmed, Fox Network programming. The local press called the new format utter insanity, but a funny thing happened. Channel 7 News became popular. It began to pick up viewers, lots of them, and the market also became competitive and eventually the #1 station in the market. Stations across the country would begin to emulate WSVN's format.
You're watching South Florida's news station, WSVN 7. Pitts, Sanchez, Daniels, Lovett. This is Channel 7 News at 6.
Confessions from a carpet cleaner.
You're watching San Antonio's news channel. KSAT 12. Salter. Gallagher. This is KSAT 12 News tonight.
A railroad crossing site, a repair crew, and a fast-moving car. Tonight, the worst happened as a collision has left 4 people...
And an entire video can and should be made on the station. But I'm gonna, cut it short here, because this series is about Fox Kids. WSVN did pick up the Saturday morning lineup, but it chose to pass on Peter Pan and later weekday offerings altogether, shunting that off to independent station Channel 39. It's easy to see why. It didn't make much sense to have Neverland at 4:30, followed by breathless details about a body in a box at 5 o'clock. What is important about this decision is that a precedent was set, and that precedent would be extremely important a few years later when Fox ended up picking up the NFL, and both Fox and big affiliate stations were going, we should partner up. So now that we've explained everything, or at least as much as we can, we're left with one last question. Why exactly do this? Why look at a block that has been off the air for 20 years at this point? Why does Fox Kids matter even today when the very concept of linear television is becoming somewhat antiquated? Fox Kids matters because it completed a transition from cookie-cutter toy-based kid shows to shows where at least a modicum of quality matters. If you grew up in the 1990s, Fox Kids matters because it was the birthplace of many of your favorite shows, regardless of whether you actually watched them on Fox Kids. Batman and Animaniacs might have been on WB-owned platforms for years, but they aired on Fox Kids first. Power Rangers called Fox Kids home for its first decade, and even in its late days, Fox Kids was a crucial place for anime, Digimon foremost among them. Fox Kids matters because it was one of the last real melting pots, a place where shows from all different producers could share space. WB, Saban, Marvel, Universal, Scholastic, Nelvana, DiC, all these studios aired some shows or another on Fox Kids. In an era of walled gardens, where studios principally showcase their works on their parent company's outlets and nowhere else, it's a welcome display of variety. Fox Kids matters because it introduced generations into fandoms. Fox Kids' X-Men and Spider-Man cartoons have been credited for introducing a generation into the Marvel Universe. Likewise, its Batman cartoon is often heralded as the definitive Batman. It exposed kids to genres from Japan like tokusatsu and anime. And its shows were from the best animation studios in the US, Canada, Japan, and Europe. Fox Kids matters because, in many ways, it's the story of the Fox Broadcasting Company itself, a rogue upstart harnessing the power of independent television stations to become a major force, and one that, once it was a major force, went from challenging the institutions to becoming part of the institution in its own right, and shedding much of what made it unique. Most of the Fox Kids assets have been scattered to the wind. The bulk went to Disney in 2001, and there have been a few sales and disposals whittling down the portfolio since. Power Rangers and its sister shows were sold off back to Haim Saban in 2010, and Haim sold them to Hasbro in 2018. Bobby's World was reclaimed by Howie Mandel at some point and is now distributed by Kabillion. The anime that comprised Fox Kids' final years have passed back to their Japanese rights holders, and a few have been relicensed by other companies. Discotech is putting out some marvelous home media releases of ex-Fox Kids animes. Aside from a few shows, shockingly little of the Fox Kids archive is available today. Of the stuff that Disney still owns, the 90s Marvel shows are by far the most well accounted for, airing on Disney+. X-Men's even getting a sequel series for that platform come fall 2023. The Tick resurfaced on Hulu in 2021, oddly branded as an ABC original for some reason, even though it never aired on ABC. The shows Disney no longer owns have fared somewhat better. Power Rangers was on Netflix for years, and Hasbro has been uploading all of it to YouTube. As of this recording, they're up to SPD, and all of the seasons that actually aired on Fox Kids are on that platform. Bobby's World is on Prime Video. The Saban dubs of Digimon are all on Hulu, and shows from third parties are easy to come by. Most of WB's Fox Kids stuff is somewhere, either on HBO Max, Hulu, or the moribund Boomerang service. Beast Wars, Beast Machines, and Dog City are examples of Fox Kids shows that you'll find on Tubi, which is ironically enough owned by the modern Fox Corporation. But there's still an alarming amount of lost media. Of the first year shows, Bobby's World is the only one available on a major streaming service. That's not good, and that underscores just how much of this stuff is at risk of flat out disappearing simply because ownership changed. If Disney comes in, or say the Here Comes Honey Boo Boo guys come in, you're at risk of losing access to your shows. Hi, Mr. Zaslav. The transition of kids' TV of all media from broadcast to pay TV and eventually streaming is a major story, but it assumes that Nick, Disney, and Cartoon Network came on fully grown, and they did not. We were always going to get to a point where 24/7 purpose-built cable networks and then streaming platforms were the dominant platforms for cartoons and kids' TV. But Fox Kids helped normalize good kids' TV outside of the big three network Saturday morning lineups. It's well past time for it to get the recognition that it deserves.